Coming up on Bible Time with Dr. Tony Crisp.
When we are studying the Bible, we need to know that the center of all the earth is Israel. The center of all the earth is Mount Zion. It is the glory and the joy of all the earth. And when we talk about the great kingdoms of the earth, our orientation has to start with Jerusalem.
This is Bible Time.
Welcome to Bible Time. Take your Bibles and open back to the book of Daniel. Last week we ended with the verses that had to do with King Nebuchadnezzar being confronted by Daniel, and we're going to pick up right where we left off. Let's begin at verse 27 of Daniel chapter 2. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, and the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." Now that is talking about the days in which we're living and those before and after us. "Your dream and visions on your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while you were on your bed about what would come after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image, a great colossus. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, and its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched, and while a stone was cut out without hands, that it was supernatural, not from this world, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will entail the interpretation, because what was it that the king was asking? Two things. What did I dream? And what does it mean? So Daniel said, "Now I'll tell you the interpretation. You, O king, are the King of Kings." Now, that doesn't mean he is the Messiah. That is a phrase that's used of the Messiah, of Jesus. But he's saying of all the kings that I'm going to talk to you about and all that have come before, and he's talking about not King David and all of those, he's talking about the secular world kingdoms. He says, you are the chief of those. You're the king of all the kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Where did Daniel say was the source of this man's rise to power? It was God Almighty. And he says, and wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the air, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over all of them. You are this head of gold. He said, here is what I'm telling you, king. That head of gold, you're it. And so it is given right here in the prophecy. But after that, there shall rise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And then a fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, insomuch that iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. So Here is the storyline. Here is King Nebuchadnezzar, and he is ruler over the greatest of the ancient kingdoms. The kingdom of Babylon lasted from 612 BC all the way down to 539 BC. It didn't last that long, but it was a great and powerful kingdom. And their philosophy of conquering people was to go and conquer the lands, especially their capital, humiliate them if they gave them any trouble, and bring them all to Babylon and indoctrinate them in the laws and teachings of the Babylonians. Now, that was not the strategy of conquering that everyone had, but the Babylonians would bring people into captivity, and then they would frighten everyone that stayed behind and leave some kind of potentate there, local power, to rule over them under the thumb of Babylon. And so King Nebuchadnezzar really dominated everything after 612 BC. Now, the reason 612 is very important is because the Assyrians were the greatest power that he had to overcome. And their capital was Nineveh. You'll remember Jonah went to them. And Nineveh is modern-day Mosul. If you're looking on a modern-day map, many of you know of people, of our soldiers, our precious soldiers who were killed in Mosul because it was a bloody battle to take that from the Iraqis when we were over there in the Gulf War against Iraq. And so that is in what is northern-day Iraq, Iraq, where Nineveh is. That was the Assyrians' capital. And so Nineveh fell, the capital of the Assyrians, in 612 BC. And so when he left Nineveh, that he had laid siege to, he came down into northern Syria and met Pharaoh Necho at what was called the Battle of Carchemish. It's a city in northern Syria today. And that was in 609 BC, 609 BC. Then after he defeated that Pharaoh of Egypt, he made the route down the Via Maris, all the way down that Mediterranean curve, which is modern-day Israel, the Gaza Strip, and he conquered all of North Africa as far as Egypt is concerned. And then he made his way back up. By this time, remember Nineveh fell in 612. Then Carchemish, that great battle with the Egyptians in 609. He went down south, came back up on his way to Babylon, and it was by that time 605 BC, so 4 years later. And when he came back through, he didn't even have to fire a shot. Everybody knew who he was by that time. And you can read about this in the Chronicles material, 2 Chronicles. And at this point, he took all of what we would call the cream of the crop. He took Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. He took all of these young men and he castrated them, took them to Babylon to indoctrinate them and make them Babylonians. And so that was the first phase of the great exile that had been prophesied by the prophets, and specifically Jeremiah, who was still alive. He went back to Babylon, took Daniel and all of these people, and basically said to the people of Jerusalem and of Judea, if you get out of line, I will come back here. And so he set up a puppet king. Again, you can read about this in 2 Chronicles and in various of the prophets. And that was in 605. Sure enough, in 597, just a few years later, not even a decade, he came back again. And he took away this time almost everyone. He left only what was called the offscouring, the lowest of the low. And this time, in the second phase of the Judean captivity and exile, he took away Ezekiel the prophet. Now, this is important because where was Daniel located as the mouthpiece of God? It was in the palace. He was speaking to the kings. He was speaking to Nebuchadnezzar and his sons. But Ezekiel was out in the Mesopotamia Valley. What does Mesopotamia mean? It's a Latin word, meso, which means in between, and Potamia, Potomac is the word for river, Potamos. A hippopotamus is a river horse. The word for horse is hippus, and the word for river is potamos or Potomac. And so that's the idea of a river horse. Well, Mesopotamia means in between the rivers, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, and most of the captives were between those two rivers, and there were canals, man-made canals, that ran between them. One of them was where Ezekiel lived, because Ezekiel said, I prophesied by the river Kibar. Well, that river was a man-made canal, and so Ezekiel was prophesying to the people, the common people. Daniel was in the palace, but there were many thousands that were left behind that were the poorest of the poor back in Judea and Jerusalem and what is called northern Israel, Samaria, and the Galilee. There were people left behind. And sure enough, they were not left without a word, because the prophet Jeremiah was with them for a season. And so God had three great prophets at one time preaching and prophesying to three different people, all of them talking about not just the times that were going on then, but what was going to happen in the future. And so there was the first phase of the Judean captivity with Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. That's when Daniel was taken. He came back in 597 and took away almost everyone else, and that had what he thought was significance. That was in 597, and this time he really meant business. Third time's the charm. He said, if I come back here, that beautiful temple that you see up there, there won't be a stone left. They didn't listen. 11 years later, in 586 BC, he came back and he totally wiped out Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, they are uncovering today. They are uncovering in these years artifacts from when Nebuchadnezzar was there 2,500 years ago. They're digging them up, and they're there underground. And what I'm telling you is, Nebuchadnezzar did just exactly what he said he would do. But that kingdom did not last long. It was great quality, but not quantity. Because if you remember this Colossus that I just read to you, where this head was of gold, that is the highest of all the metals that are mentioned here. As you go down through the kingdoms, the metal deteriorates and it digresses in its value. So what was this Colossus? It was Babylon was the gold head. Persia was the two arms and the chest. That was the Medo-Persia Empire. And that lasted from 539 BC. They're the ones that conquered Babylon without firing a shot, actually the capital. Now you've got to remember what this city of Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar had created was like. It had one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It had the river that ran all the way through the city. It came in one side and went out the other. And they had grates, iron grates that would, where that archway was, where the river ran through the city. It was absolutely spectacular and beautiful. But they had grates that went down into the river so that no one could come through unless they opened it up. They had grates where it went out and exited, and so that those who came in would have egress. They could go out, but they could shut all of that off. And the walls of Babylon were so great that they could race chariots on top of them. They were so wide. And so no one was getting in there. But you can read what the ancient historians wrote, and you remember that the book of Daniel, in this very book that we're in, tells the story of a party one night, and Belshazzar, who was a co-regent with his brother, they were partying and they were drunken, and a hand came out of nowhere and started writing on the wall and said, "You have been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting, and this night the kingdom will be taken from you." And even when that was being written, the guards on the wall were in a drunken stupor, and they had not realized when they started partying earlier in the day that Cyrus, who was the Persian king, and his kingdom of the Medes that he had just conquered, they had formed an alliance. They had gone upriver and dammed up the river very slowly, and the water had continued to go down at a very slow rate so that it would not be noticeable, so that at night they could then shut it off even more. And what happened was the level of the river went below those iron grates, and they came in up through the banks, and that was the night that the handwriting was on the wall. And we still use that phrase today. And that's when that was taken. And so the next kingdom was the Persians, and it had two ends. That's why it's the two arms, because you will read in ancient history of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, I'll talk more about this in just a moment. But that was the second kingdom, and that lasted from 539 BC all the way down to 333 BC, when you have the thighs and the belly that were bronze, and that was the kingdom of the Greeks, the Hellenists. And that was under none other than the man that we call Alexander the Great. You see, the king of Macedonia, Philip, the king of Macedonia, had a son, and this young son was named Alexander. By age 15, he was such a military genius that his father turned over the control of the entire Macedonian army to him. He conquered what is called Greece today. It was called Hellas, Hellas then. And that's why we call anyone who is Greekized or adopts Roman or Greek culture, we say they're Hellenized, because that was what the ancient country was called, was Hellas. And so he conquered all of that. Then Alexander crossed over the Bosphorus, the river that runs from the Black Sea into the Aegean Sea, that northern tip of the Mediterranean. And in ancient Greek mythology, that was called the Dardanelles. And you'll remember that. And the mystical line that was crossed from one continent to another was called the Hellespont. And that was what he crossed. He crossed over into what is Turkey today. And when he did that, he crossed into another continent. It's called the continent of Asia. Yes, Turkey is part of the continent of Asia. Greece, which is just across the river from it, is another whole continent. That is the continent of Europe. And so Alexander crossed into another continent, conquered all of what is Turkey today, what is Syria today, what is Israel today, what is Egypt today, North Africa, and he went all the way through what is the Mesopotamia, into Persian, Afghanistan, and went all the way to the Indus River, the Ganges River rather, in India. He did all of that in 3 years without any military equipment that is of a modern sense. Oh, we had military equipment, but not like we have. They had no tanks, they had no cannons, anything. What they were doing is just as swift as could be. And so they took over the Persian Empire. And I'll tell you more about that in the days ahead when we talk about the book of Revelation and the influence of the Greeks. Alexander built a great kingdom, but he did not survive and died at age 33. And when he died, there were 4 generals that divided up the kingdom. Now, why am I telling you this? Hang with me, I'm going to finish it in just a moment. But the next kingdom was the Romans. The Romans came into power in 63 BC. Now people will say, but the Romans dated back to the 7th century BC. Everything in the Bible, may I remind you, is dated in relationship to Israel. Everything in the Bible is measured by the land that's called Israel today. Even geography is gauged by Israel today. Now, for those of you who do not know what I'm talking about, for instance, there were no poles that had been discovered. The poles were there, but they hadn't been discovered. So everything in the Bible, geographically, is from the ridge that is called the Western Ridge, or the Patriarchal Road, or where the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, Samaria, Shiloh, all of those are on the Great Patriarchal Highway. It is a ridge. Watch this. From the Mediterranean, it's flat. You come up the Shephelah, the hill country, the foothills, up to the peak of a huge ridge. Now watch this. It goes straight off what we would call in the South and East Tennessee a bluff. It goes straight down. And it goes down to the lowest trough on earth. It's part of the Syrian-African rift that runs 4,000 miles. It's a crack in the earth that you can see from space. And the lowest city on earth is right below Jerusalem. It's called Jericho. And there, the Dead Sea, 1,300 feet below sea level, you can see from the Mount of Olives. It's straight off. And then it rises up again into what is the modern country of Jordan. It was called Habashan, the Golan today, but it was called the Bashan, then Gilead, and then Moab, and then Edom. That's that eastern ridge. But this is just the way that the country of Israel is, just like this, way down, and then back up to the country of Jordan, which was the land of Israel in the Bible. That was part of the 2.5 tribes that stayed on the eastern side of the Jordan. Now, why am I telling you this? Because when you look at geography in the Bible, everything is measured from that western ridge. For instance, the Dead Sea is not called the Dead Sea of the Bible. It's called the Sea of Salt, but it's called the Forward Sea. Now, why would it be called the Forward Sea? It's the word Kedem. There is no word for east in Hebrew. There's no word for east in Hebrew. You say, well, it's translated east, I know, but it means forward. Why? Because if you're standing on the eastern or on the ridge that is the Mount of Olives, behind you to the west is Mount Moriah, the temple area. In front of you, you're facing the rising of the sun. Now hang with me. Right below you is that trough, that great Syrian-African rift, and the Dead Sea is right in front of you. You're facing east. That means you're facing forward, and that's the Forward Sea right in front of you. The Hinder Sea, the sea behind, is the Western Sea, the Mediterranean. To your left is north. The Bible says that evil comes from the north. Now hang with me. If you take Latin, you will understand that the word left is the word sinistra. It comes into our language, sinister. It means someone who's sneaky. That's the connotation of it, but it's the word for left. To the right, dextros, that's the south. So you're facing the rising of the sun. In Latin, the word for that, for rise, is orient. We used to call people from the east, from China, from Southeast Asia, so forth, we call them what? Orientals. Why? Because they came from the rising of the sun. Now follow me. When you are standing on this ridge with the Temple Mount behind you, you're standing on the Mount of Olives, you are facing forward, Kedem. And that is where you got your bearings. There was no north or south in the sense of the poles and a compass. You always got your bearings from the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, but the rising of the sun was in the Latin language orient. Still to this day, when you go to a new job or you go to a new school, the first week or days is called orientation. Why do we call it orientation? Because we are getting our bearings. We're finding out where we are. This is the way that you find out where you are, is orientation. That all comes right out of the language of the Bible. Why? Because when we are studying the Bible, we need to know that the center of all the earth is Israel. The center of all the earth is Mount Zion. It is the glory and the joy of all the earth. And when we talk about the great kingdoms of the earth, our orientation has to start with Jerusalem. Why? Because it is the city of God, and it is where Messiah will reign, and the kingdom will orient from there. It will start from there. It will finish there. This is why years ago, decades ago, many of us were saying there will be a day in America, in our media, we didn't even know of the internet then, that every day we will hear of news from the land of Israel. The closer we get to the coming of Christ, the more the news will focus not on China, not on South America, not on North Korea, not on America. It will be what is happening in the land of Israel and the Middle East. Why? Because it's the center of all the earth. And it's the center of biblical prophecy. And everything, including the datings in the Bible of when kingdoms start and when they fall, is related to Israel. So Rome, even though it had already conquered what is most of Europe, their reign in the Bible is dated from 63. Why? Because that's when General Pompey conquered what is known today as the land of Israel. And so it is the center of everything, not just in biblical times past, but biblical times future. What does that tell us? God is sovereign. God is in control. You and I don't need to be worried about the future. We need to be living in the wonderful, glorious present that God's given us today, and be salt and light and be Jesus to the world around us. We don't need to fret. We don't need to worry. God has been in the control seat since the beginning, and He'll be in the control seat in the end. Do not fret. Be encouraged. Jesus is right where He needs to be, and He will be with us, and we will be with Him just when it's time.
Thank you for watching Bible Time with Dr. Tony Crisp. We hope that the Spirit of God has touched you through Tony's message, and that your knowledge of the Bible continues to grow. As you study the truth of the Bible, and you feel you do not fully understand what it means to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, we would like to help you. Contact us today at tonycrisp.org, and we will send you this free booklet, How to Know God in a Personal Way. This resource will help answer your questions about how you can begin your journey as a follower of Jesus. Bible Time with Dr. Tony Crisp is made possible because of your prayers and generous financial support. If you feel God is leading you to contribute to this ministry, you can easily give online at tonycrisp.org/donate. Or you can send your gift to P.O. Box 6596, Knoxville, Tennessee 37914. A gift in any amount is appreciated. No gift is too small, and there's no gift too large that can be used to God's highest purpose. Thank you.